This is the reason some US states would hold their ground if America came under attack, while others would collapse quickly under that kind of pressure. In this video, we break down how geography, military power, civilian culture, and disaster readiness shape which states look like fortresses and which ones look exposed. Before any "my state is tougher than yours" debate really gets going, the first thing to understand is that homeland defense in the United States operates on a national level, not 50 separate fights. Defense of US territory sits in the hands of national commands, and that shapes everything that follows. US Northern Command, often shortened to US NORTHCOM, oversees homeland defense across the continent, while NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, tracks threats through the skies. The regular armed services, including the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Space Force, form the hard military power behind those commands, and the U.S. Coast Guard stays under the Department of Homeland Security in peacetime, but shifts to the Navy in wartime. Every state also keeps a National Guard, and that structure comes out of the Militia Act of 1903, commonly called the Dick Act, which reshaped the old militia system into a modern guard with federal training and equipment standards. Under that law, and later updates, the Guard lives in two worlds, since governors can call units out for state emergencies, such as disasters or unrest, while the president can federalize the same units for national crises or overseas missions. The result is a force that can fight wildfires at home one year and deploy under federal orders the next. Some states go even further and maintain state defense forces that cannot be federalized under federal law, and those units serve only inside their own borders under the governor. Texas fields the Texas State Guard as part of the Texas Military Department and uses it to support civil authorities and back up the Army and Air National Guard with homeland security missions. New York runs the New York Guard as a non-federalized state defense force that only operates within New York, and California's State Guard stands as the ready-to-respond militia component of the California Military Department. When all of that is layered together, Homeland Defense looks like a stack of federal commands, active duty installations, National Guard units, and, in some states, extra state-controlled forces that sit behind them. To talk about which states hold and which ones fold, the video needs clear ground rules, and those rules come straight out of numbers and maps. Defense spending sits at the top of that list, and recent Defense Department reports on defense spending by state show Texas, Virginia, and California as the three largest recipients of defense dollars. Texas has climbed into the first position in the most recent data and overtook Virginia and across the country defense. Contracts reach about $600 billion in a single year, with Texas's share growing by roughly 10% over the last decade. Guard strength and active duty concentration create the second big factor, because those forces represent people on the ground and in the air rather than just money on a spreadsheet. Texas holds the largest National Guard force in the country, with about 22,367 personnel. At the same time, analyses that look at troops per capita point out that California and Texas host large military communities in raw numbers, while Alaska and Hawaii stand out for very high concentrations of military personnel once population size is taken into account. Geography, population, and density create the third piece, and this is where certain states start to look like fortresses or pressure cookers. Alaska carries about 1.28 people per square mile, which puts it at the lowest population density of any state, while Wyoming sits near 6 people per square mile and Montana around 7. Across the entire country, roughly 80% of Americans live in urban areas, yet California stands out as the most urbanized state, with about 94.2% of its residents in urban areas and Nevada close behind. Sparse states bring wide open spaces and fewer targets, and dense states pack people and infrastructure into small zones that are harder to protect or evacuate. Civilian gun ownership and the share of veterans shape a fourth factor that speaks to how a population might respond under threat. At the top of the gun ownership range sit Montana at around 66.3%, Wyoming at 66.2%, and Alaska at about 64.5%, while Idaho and West Virginia also stay above 58%. At the other end stand New Jersey at 8.9%, Hawaii at 9.1%, Massachusetts at 9.9%, and both New York and California with relatively low rates as well. Veteran status matters too, because experience and training change what a community can do. And in Alaska, more than 10% of adults are veterans, while in Virginia, the veteran share of the adult population reaches about 8.9%, which puts both states among the leaders. Resilience and disaster experience round out the picture, and that side of the story comes from storms, fires, and floods rather than armies. One analysis of billion-dollar disasters over a decade shows Texas facing 96 such events, Louisiana 44, Florida 41, and California 19, which means those states have been tested again and again. Public health reports released in 2025 still place 29 states in middle or low tiers for health emergency preparedness, even after the COVID-19 shock. Combined together, all of these pieces, defense money, troop levels, geography, guns, veterans, and disaster, readiness, create the scoreboard the video uses when it starts talking about fortress states and fragile ones. Some states look built to hang on during a crisis, and those places combine hard geography, serious military power, and a culture that already lives with risk. Alaska sits at the top of that list, and not just because of the snow. It is the largest state by area, filled with mountains, tundra, and sprawling wilderness, and with about 1.28 people per square mile. Nearly the entire map sits empty compared with the rest of the country. Limited road networks, brutal winters, and steep terrain punish anyone unfamiliar with the environment, which means simply moving around turns into a challenge before any fight starts. Strategically, Alaska looks straight across both the Arctic and the North Pacific and lies close to Russia, which gives it a front row seat in any conflict that touches those regions. Analysts describe Alaska as an Arctic front line and as a bridge between the Indo-Pacific and the Arctic, and one recent think tank report went even further, calling it a bridgehead for US-Japan cooperation across both theaters. On the ground, major installations such as Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson and Eielson Air Force Base anchor air operations, ground forces, and space-related missions inside the state. History already tested this geography during the Aleutian Islands campaign in World War II. When Japanese forces occupied Attu and Kiska, and US and Canadian troops fought from June of 1942 through August of 1943 to push them out. Harsh weather and terrain plagued both sides and caused heavy casualties, which showed how much the environment itself shapes any conflict in Alaska. Civilian life adds another layer, because the state combines gun ownership of around 64.5% with a veteran share above 10% of the adult population. Taken together, that remote terrain, the strategic position, the base network, and an armed and experienced population create a state that would drag any attacker into a long and punishing fight. Texas brings a different kind of toughness, built on volume and variety, rather than isolation. Across the state, the National Guard numbers about 22,367 members, which makes it the largest guard force in the United States. At least 14 major military installations operate inside Texas, covering Army, Air Force, and joint missions. And they knit together an enormous web of training, logistics, and operations. Defense spending shows just how big that footprint has become, because in a single fiscal year, Texas received about $71.6 billion in Defense Department spending, and the wider military presence produced an estimated economic impact of about $151 $8.2 billion. Those dollars supported around 213,000 direct jobs, which included more than 104,000 active duty personnel. So entire communities live and work inside that defense economy. The Texas State Guard stands underneath that network as a state defense force that supports civil authorities, backs up the Guard, and helps take on homeland security tasks inside the state. Geography gives Texas both reach and vulnerability, since it shares a long western and southern border with Mexico, spreads along a wide coastline on the Gulf of Mexico, and includes huge urban centers such as Houston, the Dallas-Fort Worth region, San Antonio, and Austin. Over the last decade, that same map has absorbed $96 billion disasters, the highest count of any state in that particular dataset, which shows how often Texans deal with large-scale emergencies. A recent safety ranking still placed Texas at 48th out of 50 states for overall safety, with the report including emergency preparedness and personal safety. So a gap exists between the state's raw military power and its broader safety profile. Even with that tension, the combination of guard strength, base density, defense spending, and strategic location makes Texas one of the strongest candidates for a state that would hold its ground. Hawaii tells a story built around islands, distance, and one day in December of 1941. The state sits deep in the Pacific, far from the continental United States, and that distance creates natural protection because any attacker would need to cross vast stretches of ocean, sustain long supply lines, and operate far from home. Hawaii also holds U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, which directs major military operations across the region, and bases like Pearl Harbor Naval Base, Hickam Air Force Base at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam, and Schofield Barracks anchor air, sea, and land forces on the islands. Per capita, Hawaii carries one of the highest concentrations of active duty personnel in the country, which means a large share of the population already lives inside the military system. The scar comes from December 7, 1941, the day Japanese forces struck the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and killed 2,403 Americans while wounding 1,178 more, sinking or damaging multiple battleships and destroying 188 aircraft. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress the following day, he described the attack as a date which will live in infamy. And from that moment on, Hawaii became the front line of a global war rather than just a remote outpost. Civilian gun ownership in Hawaii remains very low at about 9.1%, placing it among the lowest states in that metric, which means the island population does not resemble heavily armed regions like Alaska or Montana. Even with that difference, the combination of distance, bases, command structures, and history makes Hawaii one of the most important shield states in the entire U.S. system. Virginia's strength starts with what sits on its soil. The state borders Washington, D.C., and just across the river in Arlington stands the Pentagon, the headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense, and the nerve center for global military planning. Down the coast, Naval Station Norfolk operates as the world's largest naval base and serves as a key hub for the Atlantic Fleet and worldwide naval operations. So the state not only hosts command, it also sends ships and sailors into action. Defense spending consistently places Virginia among the top 3 states, alongside Texas and California, and a long list of major defense contractors call the state home. Companies such as Huntington Ingalls, Leidos, Booz Allen Hamilton, General Dynamics, and Lockheed Martin receive billions in Defense Department contracts from their Virginia operations, and that flow of work turns large parts of the local economy into a support structure for U.S. defense. Veterans make up about 8.9% of the adult population, one of the highest shares in the country, and that deep pool of experience sits close to the capital. When command, industry, and veteran presence come together, Virginia looks less like a regular state and more like a central organ in the body of U.S. defense. Colorado offers a different style of toughness, one hidden under granite rather than spread across sea lanes. Near Colorado Springs, the Cheyenne Mountain Complex sits inside a hollowed-out mountain and originally served as NORAD's main combat operations center. Construction on that site ran from 1961 to 1966, and engineers designed it to survive a 30-megaton nuclear blast with 23-ton blast doors and self-contained water, fuel, and infrastructure, so it could keep operating even if the outside world took heavy damage. Today, Cheyenne Mountain functions as a backup command center for NORAD and U.S. Northern Command and remains on what officials describe as warm standby, ready to take on full operations if needed. Its location far from any coast or land border gives Colorado a unique role in homeland defense, because the state holds one of the key sites for continuity of command during extreme crises. In a scenario where other locations suffer, Colorado becomes a place where military and government leaders can still monitor threats and direct responses. A cluster of interior states brings one more kind of resilience to the map, built less around bases and more around how people live. Montana and Wyoming both carry very low population densities, with only a few people per square mile, yet both show extremely high gun ownership rates, with Montana estimated at about 66.3% and Wyoming at about 66.2%. Other Great Plains states host strategic assets such as missile fields, and together these regions combine vast open country with heavily armed rural communities. These places do not match Texas or Virginia in terms of naval bases, headquarters, or raw defense dollars, and they do not hold megacities like Los Angeles or New York, yet they present a different problem for any outside force. Wide distances, rough weather in many seasons, and residents who already keep and use firearms shape a kind of toughness that depends on local familiarity with the land. In any extended crisis, those traits would make these states hard to control or pacify completely. Once the focus shifts away from bases and towards civilian resistance and exposure, a very different pattern appears. Dense populations, low civilian gun ownership, and high economic value combine in ways that make certain states look fragile in this one narrow sense, even while they remain central to U.S. power. New Jersey stands out at the bottom of the gun ownership chart with an estimated rate of about 8.9%, and it also ranks among the most densely populated states, which means many people and much infrastructure sit inside a very tight space. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, California, and Hawaii all share a similar combination of high urbanization, low civilian gun ownership, and critical infrastructure, whether that means finance, technology, shipping, or tourism. Those traits create a picture of states that rely heavily on federal security rather than civilian arms. California offers a clear example because about 94.2% of its residents live in urban areas, a higher share than any other state, and civilian gun ownership sits at about 16.3%, which falls on the lower end nationally. At the same time, California remains in the top 3 states for defense spending and hosts major installations, including Naval Base San Diego, Camp Pendleton, Beale Air Force Base, and Vandenberg Space Force Base, alongside a large state guard component. New York combines a low gun ownership rate with the dense urban core of New York City and some of the most important financial and media infrastructure on the planet, and civilian life there depends heavily on functioning federal and state institutions. Hawaii fits into this group as well, since the state shows one of the lowest gun ownership rates at around 9.1% and carries key bases and commands that are too valuable to ignore. When the lens stays fixed on civilian standoff capability, these states appear soft, yet their economic and strategic value all but guarantees they would receive heavy federal protection and investment during any crisis. That mix of vulnerability and central importance turns them into states that cannot be left to fail. The map becomes easier to read when real events show how the system reacts under fire, and several episodes in U.S. history give exactly that kind of stress test across different states. New Mexico saw one early example on March 9, 1916, when Mexican revolutionary leader Pancho Villa led more than 500 men across the border and attacked the town of Columbus. The raiders killed 17 Americans and burned part of the settlement, and the result was the U.S. punitive expedition under Brigadier General John J. Pershing, which crossed into Mexico hunting Villa and marked one of the last major cross-border raids on American soil. That response showed how quickly federal forces move when a state takes a direct hit. Hawaii endured the most famous surprise attack on U.S. territory on December 7, 1941, when Japanese aircraft struck the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. 2,403 Americans died, 1,178 sustained injuries. Multiple battleships were sunk or badly damaged, and 188 American aircraft were destroyed in the attack. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke to Congress the following day, he labeled the date a date which will live in infamy, and that speech marked the country's entry into World War II and turned Hawaii into a central war zone. Alaska became a battleground in the Aleutian Islands Campaign, which stretched from June 3, 1942 to August 15, 1943, after Japanese forces occupied Attu and Kiska. U.S. and Canadian troops fought there in harsh conditions, and heavy casualties came not only from combat, but also from the weather and the terrain, which reinforced the lesson that Alaska's environment shapes every operation. West Virginia experienced a different type of conflict from August 25 to September 2, 1921, when roughly 10,000 coal miners took up arms in the Battle of Blair Mountain, clashing with local law enforcement and private agents until the West Virginia National Guard and the U.S. Army intervened. That event remains the largest labor uprising in U.S. history and revealed how state and federal forces can deploy domestically when internal conflict escalates. New York, Virginia, and Pennsylvania all shared the trauma of September 11, 2001, when 4 hijacked planes carried out coordinated attacks. 2 aircraft slammed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, another hit the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, and a 4th crashed near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, after passengers resisted. The FBI launched an investigation known as Pent Bomb, which became the Bureau's largest case, with more than half of all FBI agents assigned to it at the peak. Taken together, all of these moments show how attacks, raids, and uprisings changed the role of individual states without ever turning the country into 50 separate wars. Behind every Guard unit and state defense force, a legal and political tug-of-war shapes who actually gives the orders when pressure builds. The Militia Act of 1903 and later laws give the president authority to federalize the National Guard, which means that units called out by governors for local missions can later shift into federal service during national emergencies or major conflicts. Recent years brought that issue back into public debate, because Pentagon memoranda encouraged all states to set up quick reaction forces, Guard units trained and ready for rapid crowd control and domestic emergency missions that would total tens of thousands of troops across the country. The result was a wave of concern in many places about militarized policing, and about the use of Guard forces in response to protests or internal unrest. California, in particular, has clashed with federal authorities over the deployment of its Guard units to support immigration enforcement or to manage protests. And state leaders have accused the federal government of overreach and of trying to militarize domestic politics. Legal scholars argue over the limits of presidential power under the Militia Act and later statutes, and over how much discretion governors should retain when their Guard units receive federal orders. The presence of state defense forces in places like Texas, New York, and California reflects state attempts to keep at least some forces entirely under governor control, since those units cannot be federalized by law. In a real crisis, That means some states might lean heavily on National Guard and defense forces alongside local police, while others push back against federal control and emphasize civilian authorities instead. Culture and politics sit alongside geography and troop strength when the country faces internal stress. When missiles, drones, and cyber attacks enter the picture, state lines start to matter less than they do on a simple map. Cyber attacks can strike power grids, banks, and communications networks that cross multiple states at once. Missiles and drones can hit targets from far away without stepping onto state soil, and national commands such as U.S. Northern Command and NORAD coordinate detection and response across the entire continent instead of leaving each state to fend for itself. Analysts who study these issues consistently point toward a unified national response whenever U.S. territory comes under serious attack, and their work makes it clear that federal commands and joint operations would drive the response rather than separate state campaigns. Popular apocalypse readiness rankings still surface from time to time, and one novelty index in 2025 placed Alaska at the top as the most prepared and New Jersey at the bottom as the least prepared, based on factors like population density, resources, and infrastructure. The creators of that index framed it around a fictional, zombie-style scenario rather than real war planning, and that framing underlines how far such lists sit from actual national defense policy. Even with those caveats, the exercise of looking at fortress states and fragile states reveals something useful. Alaska stands out as a frozen barrier, with a heavily armed and veteran-rich population. Texas combines military power with repeated disaster experience. Hawaii anchors the Pacific with Indo-Pacific Command and carries the memory of Pearl Harbor, Virginia. Concentrates command and naval power around the Pentagon and Norfolk. Colorado shelters the Cheyenne Mountain Complex as a backup command center, and frontier states such as Montana and Wyoming blend sparse populations with high gun ownership rates. Dense coastal and urban states, including New York, California, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Hawaii, bring critical finance, technology, media, and shipping infrastructure into the picture, while relying heavily on national defense and state institutions rather than civilian arms. The result is a country where toughness and vulnerability mix in different ways from one region to the next. The original question behind this video asks which state would stand firm and which one would fall apart if the United States came under attack, and the answer ends up more layered than a simple ranking. Alaska looks like one of the hardest states on Earth to invade or control. Texas and Virginia look like the heavy hitters for military power and command. Hawaii and Colorado hold key anchors in the Pacific and in the interior, and the frontier states such as Montana and Wyoming offer armed, sparsely populated backcountry that resists outside control almost by definition. Crowded and lightly armed states like New York, California, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Hawaii appear fragile if civilian resistance becomes the only measure. Yet those same states hold global financial hubs, major ports, advanced technology centers, and irreplaceable infrastructure that no serious defense plan would ever abandon. Federal dollars, national commands, and joint operations would flood into those regions in any existential crisis, and their survival would matter as much to the rest of the country as local safety matters to them. The deeper truth is that the system never expects a single state to stand alone, because the same structure that places Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, U.S. Northcom across the continent, Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii, shipyards and the Pentagon in Virginia, and a dense base network in Texas rests on the idea that the United States defends itself as one nation. Some places bring terrain, some bring bases, some bring factories and ports, and some bring financial and technological power. And the strength of the country comes from all of them working together. From Alaska's frozen wall to Texas's military muscle, from island commands in Hawaii to the naval heart of Virginia and the mountain bunker in Colorado. The map of American defense looks like a single system with 50 different stories feeding into it.